Brother loves you.
Big Brother is watching you.
War is peace.
Double think, comrade, double think.
For freedom is slavery.
The thought police, comrade. Welcome to the Ministry of Love.
Ignorance is strength.
It is one of the 20th century's most widely read books. A direct warning against the madness that lurks in modern times. George Orwell set this nightmare tale in England, in what was then the near future. It was a Cold War novel, and yet today, years after the Iron Curtain has come down, it continues to warn against a serious flaw in human nature, the lust for total power and control. Written in the late 1940s, this historic book was given a short, memorable title.
It was a cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13.
George Orwell's novel 1984 begins with clocks tolling 13 times.
This record was an astounding 22% more.
1300 hours, the precise, efficient 24-hour clock, the time of the police and of the military.
57 million metric tons. I encourage you, as a patriot,
The time of authority.
to look closely at your fellow workers, at your neighbors, even at your parents and children. Watch their activities. There could be spies working and living.
Winston Smith is the central character of the book. Depressed, in poor health and trapped, he is the ultimate anti-hero.
Big Brother is watching you. You should be watching them.
Hundreds of powerful explosions.
He is a minor member in the outer ring of the inner party, known as INGSOC. This was Orwell's satirical jab at the English socialists, a major left-wing political party in Britain at the time of the Second World War. The year of 1984 was still a quarter of a century away when Orwell began writing the book, shortly after the end of the war.
Good news from the Malabar front. Eurasian soldiers have been.
In the future world of the book, society had been divided into three great superpowers. England and the United States had become a totalitarian society called Oceania. The USSR was a dictatorship called Eurasia, and China and its allies were known as Eastasia. The three superpowers waged endless wars.
For the last 3 weeks, more than
Pig iron output has risen 3% this past fiscal year in spite of a shortfall of iron ore.
In Orwell's nightmare vision, television was a tool of the party. Developed as two-way devices, telescreens blared propaganda, while built-in cameras spied on people around the clock. They wanted to catch them with bad thoughts, a criminal activity called thought crime.
Don't move. You're under arrest.
People just disappeared,
Leave the child.
without a trace. No one dared question anything.
Reading Orwell, what is terrifying is the absence of all hope. You go in there and there is no way to resist. There's no way to remain a normal human being within that machinery.
You see, Orwell didn't think necessarily that the war had ended in 1945, and a lot of people didn't. Would the Soviets stay at the accidental military line where they ended? I think people who now go back and say, well, Orwell was a Cold War warrior, you know, and his hatred of communism was out of proportion. I think they just lack any historical perspective.
Enemy of the people, Comrade Rosenblum was executed for participating in a plot to assassinate Big Brother and several cabinet members. Comrade Rosenblum's public hanging was scheduled for Saturday on the Ministry's Asbury Square scaffold. An offer of
Winston Smith toils in the bowels of an Ingsoc Party ministry, the Ministry of Truth.
Times 14,284, meaning plenty mal-quoted chocolate.
His daily orders are to rewrite history, literally.
Rewrite for wise. Of sub anti-Friday.
The previous version of the truth is packed away and thrown down the memory hole. It is party policy rigidly enforced to maintain absolute control. In the totalitarian society Orwell describes, there are the elite party members and the proletariat. The party ignores the proles and feeds them poor food, poor alcohol, and poor books. The books are so bad that Orwell describes them as being written by machines. One of the novel's main characters is Julia. Orwell never gave her a last name. She works in the fiction department, a bureau of the Ministry of Truth. It is a wonderful Orwell twist. Julia isn't a writer, she is a mechanic, maintaining the clanking machines that automatically write pornographic fiction.
He was satirizing the meanness and beastliness of man, not just political systems, but of man himself. And the picture that you get is of an extreme picture of human behavior.
In 1984, those who control the past, ran the party slogan, control the future. And those who control the present, control the past. For the citizens of Oceania, Ingsoc controlled everything. Early in life, and his bouts with the lung disease were becoming worse. The remote, wind-swept isle seems like a difficult place for a dying man to have chosen. As a result of his poor health, Orwell, usually a quick and prolific writer, spent almost 3 years writing 1984.
He was a very puritanical man. He didn't enjoy creature comforts. He didn't want to sit comfortably by a roaring fire having a lovely time. Also, he was so far from hospital when he was in such poor health. I think he may have thought there was going to be a nuclear war. I mean, I think Jura would have been a very safe place had there been a direct hit on London.
Jura's a much harsher landscape, and most of it is mountainous. It's what the Scots call a crofting country, very, very small farms indeed. He wanted to be on his own. I think the image in his mind was the countryside. It was a place where he could be immune from the interruptions of London and could be left to himself to write. A lot of writers, after all, think of this, but they usually choose the south of France with good train connections.
George Orwell was his pen name. He was born Eric Arthur Blair in Bengal, India, in 1903. His father was a minor civil servant in a colonial agency. The family managed to get young Eric into Eton, where he did not excel academically, although he loved to read.
I interviewed a very old man who had been one of his masters at Eton, who just cursed him for being a slacker and wasting the time. But he still remembered vividly his annoyance at Orwell throwing away the chances that were offered him. But when I began to put leading questions to him, that after all he did do a hell of a lot of reading, he said, yes, oh, he did a lot of reading, but it wasn't on the syllabus.
In the 1920s and 30s, Orwell developed his writing as a journalist and political essayist. One of his first books was about the devastated lives of the poor in Paris and in London. He had decided not to publish under his real name, Eric Blair. Instead, he chose to call himself George Orwell.
But of course, if you fail with a first book as a young man or young woman, then you can start off with another name or go back to your real name.
As an economic depression spread across the globe in the 1930s and old hatreds flared into wars, Orwell had much to observe and write about. It was a terrible time in world history. Years later, as he worked on 1984 in the isolation of the island farmhouse, he reflected on the 2 decades of World War, genocide and torture that had just passed. Orwell projected these terrifying trends into the future. What if, he thought, what if? What if a tyrant were to take the idea of a minute of silence, common on National Memorial Days, and turn it on its head?
The 2 minutes hate exercise lured even the reluctant into its hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer.
But you see, this is a naughty piece of Orwell's black humour, it's sardonic humour. Instead of the 2 minutes remembrance for the dead, you have the 2 minutes willing the other side to be dead.
Orwell had lived through an era when Hitler and Stalin often whipped up national hysteria to rid themselves of political enemies. To satirize the tyrants, he had created the ultimate enemy of Big Brother. Goldstein was the target for the rage of Oceania's citizens. Goldstein was a thinly disguised reference to Trotsky, Stalin's political rival, who was eventually assassinated. Each 2-minute hate would always end with Big Brother reappearing on the screen, to the relief of everyone in Oceania. The hates were Orwellian satire aimed at political leaders who dream of total control over the minds of each and every citizen. In the last half a century, mass demonstrations and organized hates have been a regular feature of television news. But television itself has also become an instrument for manipulating hatred.
We hated Saddam Hussein, and we had some reason to think that we ought to hate him. Then we hated Osama bin Laden. We don't know what he's done, really, but we hate him, and our hate is kept going. We used to hate Gaddafi, but we've sort of stopped hating Gaddafi because things in Libya have calmed down a bit. But undoubtedly, over the next year or two, there will be other hate people set up for us. And of course, it's true that we all long to hate. There's something in us that likes to hate, and Orwell was very, very perceptive about that.
1984 was published at the beginning of the Cold War, a period of intense hatred and fear, and the book was quickly taken up as an ideological weapon by the West against the East. The irony is that George Orwell's politics were decidedly left-wing. Later he argued that he had written the book in outrage, a blast against totalitarianism anywhere, in the West as well as in the Soviet Union. But there is no doubt Orwell held a seething hatred for Stalin. A decade before he began to write 1984, he had experienced the terror of totalitarian power during the Civil War in Spain.